Hey, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Hello, Davao. It's good to see everybody online today. Thank you for muting yourself. We've had an exciting little trip over the last few weeks. We've talked about the words you select to describe your experience. And we've talked about questions. Good. Whoever's having trouble with their mic, go ahead and mute themselves. Excellent. We've also talked last week a little bit about self-awareness, which for many authors is the foundation of all leadership. And these are leadership calls, and you all are leaders in the midst of the grind. So I want to expand your leadership capabilities by expanding your self-awareness. All right, that's how all this ties together. Last week we mentioned at the end of the call that there were 3 or 4 ways that you need to expand your self-awareness. One was through quiet introspection, just sort of reflecting and thinking. And I just read a study yesterday that indicated that some people who spend too much time with self-reflection and introspection get thoroughly depressed. So do not get carried away with introspection, all right? Secondly, we also talked about seeking feedback from others, which we're going to talk in depth today. I'm going to give you 2 ways to do that. And that leads into storytelling, which is the topic for today. So many of you are like, what do I write down? You always want to know, if I'm taking notes, what do I write down? Well, this little talk today is about discovering your strengths. And the way we're going to do that is through storytelling. Okay? So that is the header. I'm taking this, I've got to give credit. I'm taking this from one of the authors that I use in a leadership class that I teach at university. He's at the Wharton School here in America. His name's Dr. Adam Grant, and he studies leadership in depth. And he said this, he said, if you want to and I agree, if you want to excel at anything, it's not enough just to fix your weaknesses. Most of us are aware of some of our weaknesses, and our tendency is that we want to get in there and fix our weaknesses. Now, if these are weaknesses that really mess us up in terms of our business, then yes, work on those somewhat, but don't concentrate on those, all right? The only thing you do if you spend all your time working on weaknesses is you develop a really strong weakness. So what I'm going to talk about today is how to leverage your strengths, right? What are you good at? What is your strength zone? If you think about Albert Einstein, many of you know him. He was all about what topic area? Physics. You're right. Well, he totally failed a French exam in language studies. He was not good at that. But if he'd only concentrated on his language skills, he might never have transformed our field of study of physics, right? Let me try another one for you literary types. How many of you have read the Harry Potter series? Harry Potter. Okay, a few of you. I would recommend it. They're kind of fun books made into movies now. J.K. Rowling, one of the richest women in the world through being a fiction writer, she realized she was highly disorganized. If you don't know her bio, really not an organized person. But if she'd only focused on becoming more orderly in her life, then she may never have honed her storytelling skills and written those great books. Harry Potter, check them out. Some of you are basketball fans of the NBA, and you were younger, you might have remembered the Chicago Bulls, who were world champions at one point, and they had a guy on the team named Dennis Rodman. Dennis Rodman was a terrible free throw shooter. Okay, does anybody know who I'm talking about? He used to be our self-appointed ambassador to North Korea, which is really, that's a different story. But he was a terrible he was a terrible free throw shooter, but you know what he got good at? He found his strength was rebounding. And he became the 7-time NBA rebounding champion. So before you can really leverage the strengths that God has given you, you've got to figure out what they are. And so to identify some of those unique capabilities, lots of people, I mean, how many of you have taken online strength assessments like Strengths Finder. Has anybody done Strengths Finder? What, couple of you? One of you. Excellent. Well, you can go online and you take these surveys and they spit out a report, and it gives you sort of an analysis of your strengths, which is always good to know. I'm going to give you a couple different ways to get at that in a different way to discover strengths. I know what we use at church is a thing called PLACE, and that analyzes people's personality, their gifts, their abilities, their passions, their life experience. And, it comes out and it's got a pie chart and some color bars, and it's really cool. And that's sort of semi-scientific stuff. And some people are happy with the results and some people aren't. Like some of you, when you've taken those kinds of tests, you take them again. I know at church, one of the women I work with took this 90-minute assessment 3 times because she wasn't happy with herself. She's like, surely these strengths are not correct, So those are all well and good, and I encourage you to look into that. But a lot of people, what they found in this research by what was his name? Yeah, Adam Grant. Dr. Grant found that people are wildly inaccurate judges of their strengths. Okay? So when that comes from people, if you said, is your strength logical thinking? People go, yes. Your reasoning skills, yes. Math aptitude, sure, they're all high. But they grossly overestimate their strengths. Some people they thought they were, how many of you know someone who thinks their strength area is humor or being funny, and they're not funny? Anybody know someone like that? Uh-huh. Some of you are sending me an email right now. Lee, you think you're funny and you're not. Fine. So most of us think about our strengths and sometimes overdo it. And we look at ourselves through rose-colored glasses. So here is the way to do it. If you want to recognize your strengths, you need other people to hold up a mirror to yourself. All right. When you see your reflection through the eyes of people who know you well, you can start to identify your most unique talents. A while back, we talked about unique ability, and we may go back to that at some point. That's a good way to do it. But a good mirror is called the reflected best self exercise. Don't write that down. It's the word. If I had to name a survey or an exercise, I would never call something the reflected best self exercise. How unmemorable is that? But that's what they named it. I'll tell you how it works. It basically involves emailing or contacting or texting people that you know well and asking them to write a little short story about a time when you were at your best. All right? So step 1. I'm going to give you the first method now. All right? So step 1 is choose your sources and ask for feedback. I'd pick out at least 5 or 10 people who know you well from different walks of life and ask them to write a little tiny memory or story about a time you were at your best. Okay? The more people you do, the better it is, better feedback. So that's your big assignment. You got to choose people and then drop them a note and ask them to tell you a story about yourself when you were doing well in any particular area. All right? So once you get some of those back, step 2 is to spot patterns. What are the patterns? Look for common themes that appear if several people write back to you, and make a list of those themes. Okay? Because that will start to suggest some strength zones for you. And then step 3, it's easy. Create a self-portrait. Okay? So just write out a brief profile of who you are when you're at your best. I've gotten feedback over the years, so it's affirmed what I thought I knew, but I enjoy teaching. I enjoy training. I don't enjoy doing things online like we're doing now. I would much rather be with you. So I could sit and watch and ask questions and talk, and we could get some two-way communication going. But I enjoy training and teaching in a performance setting, and people have affirmed that, So, and I have stories. All right, so I'm set. But I want you to choose some sources, ask them for a short story when you were winning or doing something well, and then look for patterns and kind of think, what's the What's my strength coming from this? What's the little portrait I can sketch of myself? Now, the key is on this, I would look for diversity when you're thinking about people. Don't just take, well, here, I'll just ask 3 people from the office. I would ask people in the office, so people you work with, but also think about your family or friends, professional, personal. The more mix you have, the better it is. Now, when this didn't work, it was because the feedback you got was super general. Like, ask them to be specific if you could. If you do this, ask them to be specific, because when this exercise backfires, it's usually because it's not specific. Like, it may feel good if somebody says, oh, you're a really generous person, Sonata, or gee whiz, MB, I really appreciate your ability to persist and dominate when you decide to do something. But come up with a story that surrounds that description. Don't just give, you don't want a bullet point of your strengths. You don't want a bunch of bullet points. You want a story, because stories really speak to you. Okay? Does that make sense? The richer the story, the better. They're way more powerful than doing an online survey. So there you go. That's kind of the first method of doing this. Now, some of you also, I don't know, I probably won't suggest you do this and ask for weaknesses. Like, tell me about a time I was really bad, because most of you replay those movies in your head too often anyway. And some of you are probably ultra confident. I remember a quote from Oscar Wilde, the author. If you know anything that he wrote, one of his great lines was, he said, I don't like it at all knowing what people say of me behind my back. It makes me far too conceited. So he was full of himself, as we say. So this would be kind of a fun exercise to do with the weaknesses, but I won't ask you to do that. All right? So that's kind of phase 1. And if you're thinking, man, I don't even know 10 people, let me give you a different way to do this that might not be as time consuming, but it may yield some interesting results. I'm going to ask you next week. So here's another way to do it. This is part 2 on stories to discover strengths. Divide your team or the people you work with into pairs. Now, if you're sitting in an office, like I see Bernice, she's soloing today, and Alex is sitting there very faithfully by herself. It's difficult to do this by yourself, so you have to kind of have somebody to work with. But I'm assuming in a lot of these offices, you've got at least one more person to be around. So here's how I would do it, is I would divide everybody into pairs, and then ask them to tell you a story from their past, okay? So in other words, you're sharing a story about yourself from your past with your partner, all right? Now, any memorable story will do. Keyword, memorable. You don't want to say, okay, well, let me tell you a story about how my bus ride was today into work. That's not a good story. You will reveal nothing about your strengths from your bus ride. And it doesn't have to be this pinnacle of victory like, yes, I was hiking in the Alps and my friend fell off a cliff into a crevasse and I saved his life. It doesn't, I mean, if you have a story like that, great. But it doesn't have to be that either. Just something that is memorable. I'll give you an example. When I was working at Southwestern, and those of you that work there may remember this, but in sales school once, about 15 years ago, I told one story about an experience I had selling. And it was somewhat memorable because it was involving a dirt pile. And how challenging it was. It was the worst day of my life in sales. And I described it in graphic detail. Well, that resonated with the people in the crowd. And it also, I became identified with the story, ended up telling it for the next 15 years, almost every week in training school. So it was a powerful story, and it reinforced some of my strengths. So that's a little story that if you sat down with me, I could sit and share with you. But think of something memorable that you could share with a partner, and take about, I don't know, 3 to 5 minutes to tell the story. And if you're a listener, if you're on the receiving end, you can ask questions, but you can't tell your story, obviously, until it's your turn. I wouldn't interrupt a lot. You could maybe ask some questions, but don't jump in and say, well, you think that's a good story. you should hear about the time I did. You're not trying to top your partner. All you're trying to do is discover and listen for hints of strengths. So if you're listening, when it's over, tell them kind of who they are based on what you've heard. And be specific. I wrote down 5 or 6 things, like phrases I would use to work into discovering strengths with your partner. One thing I wrote down was, your story makes me think you're great at this. Okay, that's a phrase you might think about. Or, your story makes me wonder if you might enjoy blank, because you kind of, as you listen to someone's story, if look for what I would call bright eyes. Have you ever listened to someone share a story and their eyes kind of light up and they get kind of passionate? That is, they're fully involved with the story. That's kind of what you want. So look for that. That's a good sign. You might listen and say, you know what? Your story suggests that this is kind of important to you, this particular aspect. That's a thought. Or, your story makes me respect your ability to blank, right? Or, in the future, you might think about this. So those are all ways that you can, I don't know, just have a conversation. It's kind of fun. And we learn, you can write this down, we learn who we are in community. Okay? We learn who we are in community. You learn who you are by being around other people, and they reflect things back to you. That's what self-awareness is all about. There's 2 types of self-awareness. There's internal self-awareness. That's like, I know who I am. I know what I'm good at and not good at, and I know my shortcomings, and I know my strength zones. And there's external self-awareness, and that's how we come across with other people. We'll talk about this maybe some more in the coming weeks. But I don't know if you've known somebody who was completely unaware of how they were coming across. Everybody know somebody like that? Yes. And you're like, what are they thinking? Don't they realize that they're they're just oblivious? That's external self-awareness. So we need both to become a really good leader. All right. And if you're in a position of influence there at LGFG, in our little company, make sure you remember this. Leaders need to know the stories of their team members. I was reminding Yana of this last night as she's doing well with her team in Australia. Leaders need to know the stories of their team members. When you know someone's stories, you can help them see their authentic self. Okay? When you know someone's stories, you can help them see their real self. And so that is important. And I don't know, some of you might think this is kind of, what is this all about? This is kind of frivolous. Who cares? But if you're not interested in people's stories, then when we're in management, things devolve into motivating with a carrot or a stick. I'm going to reward you for this type of behavior. I'm going to punish you for this type of behavior. And that's a real 2-dimensional leadership style. I would rather have you know somebody in a 3D fashion. And if you do, or if your teammates, in the office, if you know them well, if you know their stories, you know more about who they are, you can be better influencers with each other. Okay? So there you go. That's your assignment. You can do it either way. You can write to people and say, tell me a story. Or you can sit with a partner there in the office and say, let's share a story about each other. And you can give it a couple tries. It's not like you have 1 3-minute shot and it's over, but play with it. See how this goes. See what you learn about yourself. And it would be interesting to get some feedback. Well, as you can imagine, I do have a couple quotes because I'm about that. Patrick Rothfuss, whom you've never heard of, he wrote a book called The Name of the Wind, which sounds exciting. He said this: it's like everyone tells a story about themselves inside their own head. Always. All the time. That story makes you what you are. We build ourselves out of that story, he says, which I thought was semi-profound. Here's one more quote from Philip Pullman, in case you need to know, and I don't know who that is. He said this: after nourishment, shelter, and companionship, stories are the thing we need most in the world. Got that? After eating, shelter, companionship, the most important thing next is stories, because they tie us together. I think that's great, and that's true. So I'm going to ask you to become more self-aware of the people around you and the people you work with. And you can ask friends and family and coworkers to share some information that might give you some insights about yourself. All right? So the journey continues into self-awareness. I think it'll be fun. Have a good time. If you have any huge, astounding discoveries, drop me an email. I always like those. Some feedback, and we will continue next week. So thanks for continuing the leadership journey with me. Thanks for tuning in. Hope it's been fun. Your stories show you who you are. So go explore. Thanks. See you next week.